cultural things really are actually built on that kind of thing. Easter, you hear some really funny things about Easter. What do we do for Easter? You know, if you're, you know, in the one culture, you know, well, we lived in the desert, so let's celebrate by eating desert food. That's horrible. You know. Christians, by the way, are pretty creative. Let's get chocolate eggs from bunnies. Where the heck did that come from? It's pretty ingenious, right? You know, hey, if you got to pick a religion, I want the one with chocolate. You know.
Wasn't it based off of paganism, though? Just so
Yeah, Easter is associated with Ishtar, I think. Some people say, and so yeah, it's a pagan. You know. Well, Christianity comes from paganism.
a rabbit.
I mean, if you think about it, all of these things are connected and evolving, and so reality frustrates us. We create objects like dollars, credit cards. What's this new kind of money? Bitcoin. Is it real? And I remember friends saying, what the heck is this Bitcoin? Is it something we should invest in? No, stay away. That's just a new way of, you know, it's a new Ponzi scheme really, you know, to steal money from people. There's reality in everyday life. There's social interaction in everyday life. Language, knowledge in everyday life. All of that creates the world. It creates dollars. It creates our trust in institutions. And yet at the same time, there's objective reality that frustrates us. We want to change things, but you can't just will things away. Legitimation. What's a legitimating narrative? Symbolic universes. We create these. I mean, we don't just sit down and say, I'm going to create a symbolic universe. Although people do. Tolkien, J.K. Rowling. You've got all kinds of symbolic universes out there that people have invented. Star Wars. Spaceships out in outer space that go zoom. I mean, I remember, you know, the one line, in space, no one can hear you scream, you know. And yet, of course, you know, as Luke flies by, you know. My favorite, though, of course, is the spaceship coming by, and the music's and it just keeps coming and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then as it's flying past, it says, if you can read this, you're too close. Spaceballs. Absolutely hilarious. Dark helmet. Your Schwartz is bigger than my Schwartz. Silly stuff. So we realize that reality is out there, and yet at the same time we're amazingly creative. We can create reality. It's like concrete. Hegel calls it concrete. Concrete, of course, is a Roman invention. You mix a slurry of materials, pour them into a mold, let it dry, and it's stone. And Hegel uses the same metaphor with regard to things like money. You know, if somebody invented money, you can actually go back. I'm amazed at looking at the archaeologists digging around in sites in England and finding all of these Roman coins. And I think, you know, the Romans made a heck of a lot of coins, but they didn't do a very good job making good pockets. Because they've got coins all over the place. That's not very, I mean, you know, here, take these coins and throw them out into the lawn, kids. That's not what we use coins for. Well, along comes people like John Stuart Mill. So Mill, fascinating individual on his own. There's several different ways of spelling Stuart, so you have to be careful. He really did have that knot on his head. I don't know from when, but he was one of these kids, grew up with his father James, who raised him to be a genius. His father was a friend of Jeremy Bentham, and Jeremy Bentham is actually the official inventor of British utilitarianism. And what is utilitarianism? Utility. The idea is if morality is evolving, and we're completely in with this, I think, today. Well, actually, there's plenty of Kantians out there that believe that you have a categorical imperative. All sane humans would feel like a certain thing. You know, don't beat up the girl in the car, issue. But at the time, they're thinking, wait a minute, morality is just like everything else. Our moral narratives evolve. They get better. We're progressing. And as a result, the morality that we live by today is an improvement over years ago. Favorite example of this is Thomas Jefferson. I was listening to a professor from Harvard talking about if she ever met Thomas Jefferson, what would she do? She would shake him. She said, I would just shake him. Why? Well, of course, here he is writing, all men are created equal, and have these unalienable rights, etc. But what's he thinking? He's obviously not thinking what we think when we say all men, because he's thinking other men in this room that have property in Virginia and went to school and have wealth and own people, by the way. Oh, I don't mean those. I mean, those of us in this room, we're equal to King George. Why does he think he is so much better than us? That's what's wrong. We're the same as King George. Well, we're at the point today where our contract with one another has enabled us to expand it to include more people than was originally part of the contract, right? Women became part of the contract. Young kids under 18 or 16, still not part of the contract. It's kind of interesting at what point, obviously some kids are much more mature than others, but they don't get to vote until they're old enough, right? So you have to age into the contract. An awful lot of the concern right now, what are aliens, other than, ETs that come from outer space. We're talking about people with green cards or illegals, right? Are they part of the contract? Do people that don't have a legal right to be in the country have the same rights as people in the country? We're arguing over that. So, that's the kind of thing that's changing. So the idea of morality as evolving and progressing, what kind of morality ought a person to have? Well, Jeremy Bentham gives us the idea of a hedonistic calculus. A hedonistic calculus. A hedon is a unit of pleasure. So basically, he argues that what we should do is try to increase the amount of pleasure in the world and reduce the amount of pain. And he thinks that we could literally scientifically measure this so that we can actually look at a particular set of choices that we have to make, figure out how much pain or pleasure each of these choices would make, and then choose the one that gives us the greatest pleasure. And that's what we should pick. In government, right? I mean, if you think, wow, that's weird, the same thing happens in the United States with John Rawls. Utility. Justice is fairness. We should create laws that are going to benefit those who have the least, because we want equal opportunity. And John Rawls was one of the significant American philosophers. If you think about it, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Rousseau, they're the social contract philosophers, and we kind of accepted that what we have is a legitimating narrative, legitimates our way of viewing the world and thinking individuals have rights and so on. So we're all contracting with one another and creating these rights, and we've added rights as we go. It would have been silly to ask Thomas Jefferson, should people have the right to health? I wouldn't even be able to conceive of some sort of right to medical care. You didn't want medical care, it always killed you back then, right? George Washington rides around Mount Vernon on his horse on a rainy day, comes back and he has pneumonia, and the doctor's called, the doctor comes and bleeds him, which weakens him, of course, right? But the thought was, wow, you've got these 4 humors, and what we want to do is get you healthy, so we got to get the balance back in the humors. The only way we can do that is to decrease the amount of blood you have. That'll bring them back into harmony, and you'll be healthy again. It didn't work. Next day, the doctor came and they bled him again. He's an important guy. Give him the treatment twice. And then he died the next day, probably because of the doctor's care. He really did that, Had special pants, bled people. Thought that would make you healthier. Justice is fairness. Today we can have the issue of health care because we have a science that enables us to have health care. But can we make that decision? Or does Rawls get into this issue over, well, wait a minute. Can society afford everybody to go to the best hospitals and get the best health care? Absolutely not. Nobody has that much money. We look at the United States and everybody says, we ought to have universal health care just like Scandinavian countries. Well, Scandinavian countries have fewer people than Rhode Island, usually, something close to that. As a country, they're like, Philadelphia. And the people are pretty much all the same people. And they all live the same kind of lives, pretty much. And so they can have universal health care. But the United States is an open country to all kinds of folks that come in from all kinds of places. We're not even sure who's here, right? And if we guarantee the same kind of universal health care for every person that shows up at the hospitals tell us, we can't afford this, we need more money, or we have to close. Or we try to open different kinds of clinics where we give people different levels of care. Because money, right? Right? So the United States always shows up as a poor comparison to these smaller countries that are more like one another than this huge mixture of all kinds of people, many of whom do get better care than they get in Norway if they have the money, right? I have friends that went to Mexico for better health care because it was cheaper. That's almost silly, isn't it? Right? You know, how many people go to Canada for health care? How many Canadians come to the United States for health care? You get the idea. Money, reality. Reality is there. And it interferes with our dreams of making everyone happy. But utility is the idea of somehow measuring happiness. A hedon. Seems silly. I think to myself, well, how do I make my decisions? Here it is, the state fair is on, and everybody in my family wants to go. They have all their favorite things they like to do at the fair. I have some things at the fair I love to do myself. I love to visit the animals, walk through and see all the different animal displays and so on. I love the smell of that dairy air. That's a joke. Sorry. Came from one of the games my kids used to play. But in any case, my wife loves to go to the quilt show. She sits there and she watches the lady. Now, this one was knitted together with, 5 different women, and they use the pattern that's, and the only quilt I was ever really thrilled about was the one that somebody made taking all of the Crown Royal bags. And ever since then, I've been saving the bags up, thinking, maybe somebody will make me a quilt of those bags. That's funny too, right? However, John Stuart Mill gives us a John Rawlsian kind of point of view. We can try to make justice fair, but if we're going to do that, we have to realize that some people deserve more than others. So if it's going to be fair, the people that are really expensive deserve what they get. Whenever the opera used to come to town, you would pay like $80 a ticket or something, and you'd go to see the opera, and there was hardly anybody there. Because, well, let's face it, how many of you go to operas? See? How many of you go to wrestling?